Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of 1968. In the previous lecture, we talked about the events during that year in the nation of China. In this lecture, we turn to one of China's neighbors, Japan. Like many other nations, Japan was racked by protest throughout the late 1960s, peaking in 1968. The events in Japan share much in common with other parts of the world, although there were some unique conditions at work there. In the midst of recovery after the devastation of World War II, Japan was undergoing a period of rapid growth that left some unsettled. It was also very much influenced, perhaps controlled, by the United States, which offered aid and assistance to rebuild the nation and its economy in the years after the war. Japan's proximity to Vietnam also played a role in the protests, as America utilized Japan as a jumping-off point for many of its operations in Vietnam. Japanese students, like others around the world, embraced their newfound independence and adulthood by engaging in protest in those years. Unlike some other places, their protests did not so much involve cultural or sexual liberation. Japanese students typically remained conservative in those regards, but they did involve challenging their elders and their nation's leaders. The roots of Japan's 1968 student uprisings can be found years earlier. In 1960, many citizens in Japan opposed ratification of the United States-Japan Security Treaty. At that time, a group of students opposed to the treaty assumed control of the All-Japan League of Student Governments, called the Zengakuren. Students of that generation were particularly averse to militarization and war, recognizing that just a generation earlier, their parents had been dragged into World War II by a zealous imperial regime. While the Zengakuren failed to prevent the signing of the Security Treaty in 1960, the episode established a tradition of mobilization among Japanese students, and in the following years, the Zengakuren grew and spread throughout the nation, with branches at most universities and schools, and taking on a paramilitary bent. Many of the Zengakuren fancied themselves modern-day samurai, who trained in combat methods. When the convulsions of 1968 hit Japan, they were ready. Japan's baby boom generation shared some of the disillusionment of students of the late 60s in other parts of the world. They were frustrated with their parents' generation, which had led them into the ruinous years of World War II. But they also struggled to see good alternatives. Their rival, China, was struggling through the catastrophe of the Great Leap Forward and then the Cultural Revolution. The Soviet Union seemed rife with human rights oppression. The crush of attempts at freedom in Hungary, Yugoslavia, Poland, and Czechoslovakia left Japanese students unhappy with the prospect of socialism or communism. But America seemed a poor alternative for many of them as well. The Americans were in the midst of a war of imperialism and repression in nearby Vietnam, in fact, relying on support for their efforts from Japan itself. Japanese youth were not of a mind to support American policies. The first spasms of rebellion hit in October 1967, when Japanese students convened on Tokyo's Haneda Airport to prevent Prime Minister Sato Isaku from traveling to South Vietnam on a trip to consult with the American leadership overseeing the combat there. Students wearing construction helmets and wielding 2x4s clashed with police. In the violence, one student was killed, and there were numerous injuries on both sides. The students flailing against police with wooden beams, watched by millions on color television, struck a chord with the disillusioned youth of Japan. The Zengakuren was revived, and tens of thousands of students around the country joined their ranks and began pseudo-military training. It was not the last time that Japanese authorities would confront students wildly thrashing at them with 2x4s. In January 1968, 47,000 protesters converged on Sasebo Harbor near the United States Naval Base to protest the arrival of the American aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise, on its way to Vietnam. The United States was utilizing more than 100 military bases in Japan in support of its war in Vietnam, and Japanese industry was a massive supplier of war goods for the United States. Cars and trucks, ammunition, spare parts, raw materials, minerals, plastic, and even body bags were provided by Japan. The arrival of the Enterprise, believed to be powered by nuclear reactors and carrying nuclear weapons, struck an even more sensitive nerve in that part of Japan, not far from Nagasaki, the site of the second atomic bomb dropped at the end of World War II. The Zengakuren rallied into action at Sasebo Harbor. They arrived by the thousands, wearing helmets and masks and wielding wooden poles. Blocking a narrow bridge and moving forward in rhythmic surges marked by whistles from their comrades, the Zengakuren were confronted by 5,000 riot police wielding clubs and launching tear gas. The police assault was ruthless. Many students were bloodied senseless, and some 450 were hospitalized. A nearby hospital, where students sought shelter from the attack, was flooded with water and blasted with tear gas by the authorities. Fleeing students were attacked and beaten. The viciousness of the attack sparked sympathy for the students, who were aided by civilians in the area and hospital staff. The next day, the massive Enterprise docked at Sasebo, a huge symbol of the American presence in the area. As it pulled into the harbor, a protester named Makoto Oda circled the massive ship in a tiny dinghy, calling through a megaphone to the sailors on the ship. Later that day, as sailors headed into town for shore leave, their taxis were surrounded by protesters who banged on the cars and yelled at the sailors. The police were called in once again, and 150 more students wound up in the hospital. The Enterprise, its mission complete, left Japan earlier than expected as a crowd of protesters shouted and shook their fists at the departing ship. They achieved a symbolic victory, perhaps, but did nothing to stop the violence in Vietnam or in their own streets. In June, the protest resumed, this time with Zengakuren protesters converging on a freight train carrying munitions destined for American troops in Vietnam. Thousands of students, joined by some workers, gathered outside the Kitakyushu station and sat down on the tracks, forcing the train to stop. A 9-hour standoff ended when police again attacked the protesters and drove them off, allowing the train to proceed. In July, students and farmers joined together in a protest in Narita, not far from Tokyo, where construction of a massive new airport designed for use by American warplanes was underway. Farmers in the area resented the seizure and damage to farmlands, and the construction was disrupted many times as farmers and protesters tore down fences at the perimeter of the site, stole or damaged supplies and equipment, and engaged in sit-down strikes to prevent construction. The farmers welcomed the swelling protest movement into their ranks, offering food and shelter to students and others who flocked to the protest at the site. On July 17th, the makeshift army of protesters clashed with police outside the site, erecting barricades from construction supplies and farm implements. They carried sickles and poles against police carrying metal clubs, shields, and guns. In several waves, the riot police stormed the makeshift defenses of the farmers and Zengakuren, eventually dismantling the barricades and scattering the protesters. The farmers returned to the countryside, occasionally resurfacing to protest the airport construction, but organized resistance had been crushed. The protest also spread to college campuses, calling for greater academic and personal freedom, but also gripped by the excitement touched by students everywhere in 1968. In June, students at the University of Tokyo and at Nihon University created Zengakuren, all-campus joint struggle councils. Armed with hard hats and 2x4s, they occupied campus offices and battled against police and officials attempting to uproot them. The movement eventually spread to hundreds of universities and high schools around the country, and elicited much sympathy from the media and many Japanese citizens. While the Zengakuren movement was widespread throughout the country, it never really consolidated into a coherent movement with clear goals. Each campus had its own student coalition, and most of their complaints revolved around conditions on their individual campuses. Only sporadically did these groups address broader national goals, such as opposition to the Vietnam War. This led to spottiness of commitment from students and a less impactful movement overall than those in nations like the United States, Mexico, or France, as just a few examples. Because the movement was scattered across campuses all over the country, it's also difficult to know how many people participated in it. Some scholars estimate that about 20% of Japanese students participated in the protest, perhaps 300,000 total at its height. The movement waned in 1969, after the Japanese government enacted what were known as university management laws, allowing for the police to suppress disturbances on campuses. And just as a side note, campus autonomy is a common theme in the global protests of 1968, and the willingness and ability of authorities to crack down on protests at universities is one point that students might consider when comparing and contrasting the various movements around the world. Japanese officials were initially reluctant to intercede in campus affairs, but after 6 months or so of protest, they showed a greater willingness to put them down. They also developed more effective defenses against students swinging 2x4s, including limiting the supply of such wood around campuses and equipping troops with stronger armor against them. The pseudo-samurai of the Zengakuren found their stick-swinging displays, while dramatic, were less effective over time. The movement also found itself losing favor with the media and the Japanese population by 1969 and 70, as the economy and material conditions in the country continued to improve, and as the nation, like many around the world, grew weary of students marching in the streets. The Japanese people were more likely to grumble about students wasting their time and money rather than supporting their efforts. A law and order mentality, similar to that seen in the United States, pervaded in Japan by the early 1970s. The student movement also lost steam due to student apathy. The initial enthusiasm of the first few months eroded both with the passage of time and with the increasing harshness of the police response. Not only Japanese citizens, but also many students themselves began to wonder what they were doing with their time in school, and gradually they made their way back to the classroom. By the early 1970s, only a small group of extremist students remained in the movement, and there were some dramatic episodes, including students hijacking a jetliner in the early 70s, and some students joining Palestinian guerrillas fighting in the Middle East. In February 1972, 12 students were murdered at a secret mountain hideout in Japan after a long standoff with the police. After this bloody incident, any remaining interest in the student protest evaporated, effectively ending the student movement in Japan. In our next lecture, we'll return to Europe and discuss the events in another nation in 1968, Yugoslavia.